Okay, I am going to get started and say thank you to everybody for taking the time this evening to join us. My name's Paola Brody. I'm from the team of Voices of Benalong, and Michelle Rawson and myself are going to be your hosts for this evening. To start off, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the area in which we live, the Benalong electorate, is on the land of the Wallamadigal people of the Darug Nation, the traditional owners of this land. Voices of Benalong acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who now reside within the area, and we pay our respects to their ancestors and elders past, present and emerging. We respect their heritage and acknowledge and uphold their intrinsic connection and continuing relationships to country. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders belong to the oldest continuous living culture in the world, and their sovereignty over their lands was never ceded. So before we begin and start talking about integrity tonight, please note the event is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube. So please, if you want to maintain any privacy, please turn your cameras off. It will be available then for people to view again at their leisure, and please ensure that your microphones remain muted. But thank you so much. It's been pretty uneventful in the muting so far. Now, integrity in politics is a massive topic, and we've only just 1 hour to explore it. To best use our time, Michelle and I have some questions that we will ask our guests on some topics, some big important topics of the current news cycle. If there is a question that comes to you during the discussion that you'd like to ask our guests, please send a direct message through the chat function to David Bessier, who's going to be managing our chat and questions tonight. We'll do our best to incorporate the questions as we go, and then we will try and, if we've got time at the end, include some more questions. At this point, I am going to hand over to Michelle, who's going to get our discussion started. So thank you.
Thanks, Paula. So my name is Michelle Rawson, and I am president of Voices of Benalong. We're a group of volunteers that want a representative in federal parliament who understands what the community cares about and acts as a true advocate on our behalf. Our purpose is to hear what issues are important to you, then find and support a local candidate who will be an active representative for us in federal parliament. They will act on our behalf and vote accordingly, rather than follow what the party tells them, which is often for the benefit of vested interests first and the community second. We're organised and we're implementing a plan. Our plan is focused around 2 phases, a listening phase and an action phase. So if you're frustrated by the current political situation, live in Benalong and want to be part of a movement that's acting to change it, please visit our website at www.voicesofbenalong.org or email us at voicesofbenalong@gmail.com. David will post the links for you there in the chat now. So thanks, David, for doing that. We're currently in the listening phase of our plan, and so far there are 2 standout areas that research has shown the voters of Benalong want action on. So they're climate change and the return of integrity to politics. Both issues have been dominating the news cycle for the past couple of months, and tonight we're going to focus on the latter. From our listening phase, it is clear that integrity is an important issue to Benalong. To help us make sense of what integrity actually means, the standards we should accept from those who represent us, and what steps we can take now to make a difference, we have 2 amazing guests for you tonight. So I would like to extend a very warm welcome to Craig Reucassel and Anthony Whealy. Sorry, Anthony. Craig is an Australian television and radio comedian who is best known for the documentary series Big Weather, The Fight for Planet A, War and Waste, and his work on the satirical comedy group The Chaser, which I'm a huge fan of. More recently, Craig has directed the engaging documentary Big Deal, which looks at how vested interest groups influence our democracy through political donations and lobbying, using big money to buy access to our politicians. Craig brings a wealth of experience and an impressive track record in delivering engaging contact and impact campaigns that raise awareness, change behaviour, and influence the policy arena. So thank you, Craig, for joining us tonight. It is so wonderful to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Anthony Whealy is a highly esteemed former Justice of Supreme Court of the New South Wales Court of Appeal and is current chairman of the Centre of Public Integrity, which is just an amazing organisation. It's an independent think tank dedicated to preventing corruption and protecting the integrity of our accountability institutions and eliminating the undue influence of money into politics. So it's really important. So in short, Anthony Whealy is one of the guardians who works tirelessly on our behalf to protect the safeguards of our democracy. So thank you, Anthony, and thank you for coming and being here. So tonight I would like to start the discussion with you, Anthony. We often hear politicians talk about how important integrity is to them and how they are of the utmost integrity. What is integrity, and are our concerns about it diminishing justified?
Anthony, you've been silenced, by the way. You're on silent there.
Thanks.
I don't know if because of some external forces.
I was just teasing you all. Integrity in public life. The way I would define it is, I would say that it is the expectation we have as citizens that our politicians and those appointed to public life will observe the highest ethical standards in the conduct of public affairs. And integrity in that sense is a kind of essential chemical component in maintaining trust between citizens and the government. So if trust is broken, the whole system of democracy, as we like to understand it, is broken, or at least it's in danger of breaking. So in practical terms, we ask our politicians, and particularly the ministers who have the highest responsibilities, to always act in the public interest and not in their own interests, or in the interests of what we might describe as vested interests, particularly big donors and the like. We want, in other words, ministers to be impartial and not partisan. Secondly, we want them always to be transparent and open in their dealings and in their reports to the public. And thirdly, we demand really that they will not deceive us and that they will always be honest with us. So there are three practical ways in which integrity is maintained and demonstrated. When we look at Australia, what do we see? Well, the first thing I would say is that our country is really quite fortunate compared to so many other countries where democracy and integrity are almost gone entirely. We're not at that stage, but we do know our corruption perception index that's operated by Transparency International has Australia sliding down the pole on perceptions of integrity. Secondly, we know that the community, by way of many polls, distrusts politicians. And I see that the Voices movements, such as Benalong, is a kind of reaction, almost a revolt really, against a very clear lack of trust in the political system. So are we being too precious? Are things maybe better than I'm saying? Well, if we look just very quickly, what we see is a category of disasters, really.
Anthony, we've lost your mic again, I think.
He's back on mute, is that?
Anthony, you're back on mute. I'm not sure if you can hear us.
It's a conspiracy.
You've been silenced.
I've been silenced, exactly.
You've said too much, Anthony. You've said too much. Even your camera's turned off.
I know who's doing this to me. My camera's gone. Now you can't see me. Now
it's ASIO.
I know, just about to be carted off. Anyway, I was saying that, I'm sorry about that. I was saying that I was getting too heated up. I think that's the problem. So what I've said is misuse of public money, failure for politicians to be accountable, the covering up of departmental reports, failing to act in accordance with the law and ministerial codes of conduct. They're pretty serious things, and I could give you many examples of them. The sports rort scandal was one that has been much looked at. But what really sort of annoyed me was that nobody was accountable about it. Nobody stepped up to say, well, look, we did ignore the Constitution of Australia. We did ignore the statute under which the grants were set up. We did breach the guidelines. And as Minister, here I am, Bridget McKenzie, to tell you that I admit that I breached the ministerial code of conduct. Well, we didn't get anything like that. We just had politicians saying, oh, all these grants were eligible and it was good for the community anyway. And that's the kind of lack of accountability and lack of honesty that really riles me. And I hope it riles other people who look at these things carefully. So in all of that, and for all those reasons, I think, and more recently, I think what I would describe as the arguable massive deception on climate policy by the government and the kind of dumbed down response of the Labor Party to it really worries me. There's another example, I think, of a lack of transparency and a lack of integrity on an issue that's so important to so many people. All right, so if you don't have integrity, then you have, on the other side of the coin, corrupt practices. And that's one of the things that we're very concerned about, the need to control corruption and corrupt conduct. So that's my answer in general terms as to integrity.
Thank you, Anthony. That's it's really good. Would you agree with that, Craig? Have you had any?
I definitely agree with it. Yes, I'm not going to argue with Anthony on this. It's interesting because, I mean, of course, Anthony coming from the legal fraternity and being, a former judge, and the notion of justice not only being done but being seen to be done, that kind of concept of, seeming like the system is working properly. One of the things I think is fascinating with our current democratic system is that the way that most of the public would perceive integrity is not necessarily reflected in the reality of how it actually works in Australia. And I think coming back to that notion of democracy is really important. At its core is that idea of one person, one vote. At its core is the idea of our democratic representatives representing the community, being their cipher, kind of being your representative in Parliament. But if you have these other systems where you have large donations happening, where you have, all these other influences in play, it takes away from that integrity. And that's not at the core of democracy. That's not at the core of it. So it undermines that democracy. It undermines that notion of integrity that most of us in the community will be looking for. So, yeah, it is being, I think Anthony's right. The idea of the public interest above vested interests is a crucial one. And unfortunately, we've seen some polling in Australia showing that a majority of us think that politicians put vested interests before the public interest. And that's concerning because that erodes that trust that's there. And I think it's really important, as we've seen during this period of the pandemic, to have trust in politicians is actually a vital thing for protecting your nation.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. David, are there any questions in the chat? I'm looking at it now. I think everybody's so riveted.
None so far.
Yeah.
Remember, okay. You can just put them in the chat. You don't have to go via David. It's a very complex system. I'm trying to get a message to somebody specifically on Zoom. It takes a good day or two.
Requires some technological lessons.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, we might move on to the next question. So, Paula, over to you.
Okay, no problem. So now that we've talked a bit about what integrity is, the next thing is sort of more talking in detail around how we apply this into our federal government. So we've seen a popular, well-respected politician in New South Wales, who many consider to be full of integrity, resign over an issue that many think is trivial. We then have our Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce, using the situation to argue to not introduce a Federal Integrity Commission or a federal ICAC similar to the New South Wales. So, Anthony, Would a federal ICAC be, as Barnaby says, like the Spanish Inquisition, a law unto itself?
Well, actually, you know, Barnaby went to the same school as I did. I understand from his teachers that he was a very poor history student. So I think that reflects itself in his observation about the Inquisition. But I think Barnaby's, a lot of other things about Barnaby are very strange too. But just taking that particular point, we don't have an anti-corruption body at federal level. And you might think that's very odd because we do in every state and territory. And there's been a movement to have a federal anti-corruption body established for the Commonwealth, but maybe 5 years I've been arguing about it now, and you might think I'm a very poor advocate because we still do not have one. So let us just consider for 1 minute the issues surrounding the Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, who admittedly is a very popular figure and who always had a reputation for honesty and integrity. Nevertheless, the issues surrounding the Premier at the moment in the New South Wales ICAC are quite serious, and they involve the question of whether there was a substantial breach of the ministerial code by Ms Berejiklian when she was Treasurer, but not revealing her relationship.
We lost, is it just me? We lost Anthony.
We've lost him, I think.
All right, we might.
He's back.
He's back.
Right?
You're back, Anthony.
Oh, thanks. I'm sorry. Where did I get to?
You were just talking about the Premier.
Yeah, what I'm saying was a very serious matter that's being investigated. It's not trivial. It really isn't. As much as we like Gladys Berejiklian, she, like other politicians, has to submit herself to the highest standards of integrity, and popularity is no way that that can be avoided. So the issue is, you know, whether she breached the ministerial code of conduct, and it will be a matter for ICAC to determine that. So it's not a trivial matter. The second thing I would say is that the reaction of the Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce, Jason Falznick, the member for McKellar, and my old favourite Graham Richardson, they all said, what a terrible model this New South Wales ICAC is. And the Prime Minister said, well, we certainly don't want that model. And I'd agree, he doesn't want that model because I'm quite confident he doesn't want scrutiny and accountability. And that's what this model will bring. So it is astounding that we don't have a Federal Integrity Commission. The government has a model that's presently just at the stage really of a kind of exposure draft. It's not actually a bill, but it's a terrible model, and it's designed to protect politicians from being scrutinised. I know that's a very broad claim for me to make, and I could give you all the detail if we had time and if you're interested, but effectively it operates to stop the scrutiny of Parliament and parliamentarians and ministers and their staff. And that's really a bad thing for integrity in Australia. There's some possibility that they will modify that model, maybe before Christmas. But if they do, I'm quite satisfied it won't be good enough. And we have before the Parliament now a perfectly good model, a bill put forward by Helen Haynes for a corruption body, which is terrific. But do you think they'll let that get through? We need 2 members of the government to cross the floor for Helen Haynes's bill to get up. I wonder whether we could persuade John Alexander to do that. Maybe you guys could put a bit of pressure on him. You certainly should ask him whether he's prepared to.
Yeah.
It won't get to become law otherwise. So that's
really interesting you say that, because one of my next question talks to that point, and this is for you, Craig, is we talk about the mechanism that we will use for managing corruption and matters of integrity. But then we talk of what are the standards we should be accepting from our representatives. So you have on one hand pork barrelling, and which some people do think is okay because it gives their electorate the things they want. That's what they vote for. That's where the money goes and it comes back to them. But then on the other hand, and to what Anthony was just discussing, my issue is that you get members of parliament stand up and make speeches in parliament or talk to members of their community and have stated positions, and then they go into parliament and vote against legislation. And to me, that's a question of integrity. So then how do we collectively develop standards that we can all accept for our representatives, and can we do that?
Yeah, and look, it's interesting that the pork barrelling question is an interesting one, because it was fascinating to see Gladys Berejiklian respond to that by saying, well, this is not against the law, and this is, you know, all sides of parliament do this. And it is true, the balance between, you know, I'm just a great member getting lots of money from my electorate and getting you, you know, parking lots at railways, that's apparently the very core of democracy. I think the Greeks did that first, parking lots at the railway. You know, that is true, that the line between that can be a bit hazier. But as Anthony points out, it's, you know, when criteria is put in place and that's all breached, then that moves beyond the normality of pork barrelling. If you're going to say, look, we're just going to support the hell out of our electorates, we're going to put the money there and there's no criteria and that's how we're going to do it, at least you're being upfront about it. That's, I guess, yeah, you can't necessarily say that's totally undemocratic in that sense if there's not the standards there. It is different when you talk about putting money towards not your electorate, but putting money towards donors and people like that, and people that aren't necessarily put out front, you know, people like you don't necessarily admit that relationship with. And to be honest, even if you do admit the relationship, it can be quite hazy. And in a sense, this is where Gladys Berejiklian has been caught, is because she hasn't been upfront about the relationship, you know, with the partner from Wagga Wagga. And that's so crucial to this, is that it seems like all of her decisions were based on not saying that that relationship was there, even though she was trying to be legitimate in many other ways. For me personally, as an outsider to the political game, the thing I find most amazing actually is the fact that at one point, and again, I'm not going to make a comment about how much Gladys knew about this or not, it's up to ICAC to decide. I find it amazing that at one point, you know, you could be saying, Daryl's going to get a $1.5 million kickback from a real estate deal, and you can be accepting that that's a normal thing that could happen for a politician. I think when you go into politics, they're well paid. You know, it's a really important public service job. You shouldn't be on the side, be doing real estate jobs. I mean, fascinatingly, in New South Wales and Queensland, we have laws which have restricted donations from property developers because it's been recognised that they have such an effect on our democracy. It even went to this, it's gone to the Supreme Court, it's gone to the High Court in both cases, and has been upheld as a legitimate democratic restriction because they've seen the damage that can be done. If we've got members who are basically doing real estate deals on the side, to me, that's a prima facie case of a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not commenting again on whether Gladys knew, but it's extraordinary that seems to be accepted, that that's something that could have existed within the system. That for me shows a system that it already is broken. And this is part of the problem with all of these rules, is that the documentary Big Deal does not deal with a single example of illegality. We don't show anything that's illegal. Nothing would ever end up in front of Anthony Whealy's court. And that's the bloody point of it. Is to go, all of this is the rules. This is within the rules. This is what we accept as the rules in this country. And it's just, I think it's very much out of line with what people would expect. So, you know, it's about getting our system to be actually in line with public expectations, you know, about the fact that, yeah, you're not taking $100,000 lunches from somebody. You are being upfront about that. You are being upfront about your relationships, whether it be your husband or partner or whatever involved in a deal. All of that stuff has to be upfront. And if you don't have that, then, you know, you have, again, erosion of trust that goes to the core of it. So I think in many, it's a lot of ways we've got to realign our democratic system with our actual expectations, I think.
Yeah, and it comes back to that point that Anthony made about being transparent, open and honest, and the lack of accountability. So we know what the standard is. And
can I just say that one of the interesting things about doing the Big Deal documentary is I really do think that we discovered that transparency is not enough. It's an essential part of it, but it's not enough. So for me, for instance, for me personally, knowing that Clive Palmer has put $80 million into the electorate and putting into advertising, that's great, but it's such an imbalancing effect on democracy to have one party that has that much impact. It really dilutes that core notion of one person, one vote to such an extent that you need to have caps as well, I think. You need to be able to limit those things, because otherwise you could go, yeah, Clive Palmer's not going to not be upfront about it. He loves telling you. He'll tell you put in 120 million. To be honest, he'll exaggerate it.
It is okay. Do you think that the system's getting worse then, or has been over time?
I think there were some laws. There were changes to the laws made under John Howard, and that did unfortunately make things a lot less transparent.
Yeah.
What's interesting is to see that at state levels they've been going the other way. So there's been more transparency and more caps and that coming in at state levels, generally in response to corruption scandals. And so it's great to see it happening there. It's interesting, the two issues that come up in Voices for Things, which are integrity and climate often, are two things where our federal government seems at odds with others. We see state governments of Liberal and Labor kind of actually being active, and yet at the federal level they're not. And I wonder if there's a real link between that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now we've got a couple of questions. One being, can you see it getting worse? But can you see it getting better? Is the other question.
Well, I don't think you're going to get. I don't think you're going to get an improvement until we have a federal anti-corruption body in place, because there's no deterrent. And secondly, there's no real body that can look at these areas. And I'm not talking about illegality now. I agree with Craig that corruption takes many forms. And sure, handing someone $100,000 in a brown envelope to get a political favour is obviously illegal. That's just bribery. But giving a huge donation and then quietly sitting back and expecting a favour to emerge and seeing a year later that it does may not be illegal, but it's very undesirable. So unless you have a body that can act as a deterrent, and unless you have a body that can actually investigate things like the sports rot scandal or branch stacking at a federal level, as we've seen just recently, re-agitated by the media, unless you have a body that does that, then they're going to continue to be unaccountable. Why should they change their ways? There's no incentive for them to do so. And if they win an election as a consequence of all this poor behaviour, they'll pat themselves on the back. Terrific! What a great election that was. So we need to put a few of them on their backside and let them be exposed publicly for what they're doing, and then I think there'll be a change.
Well, sorry, go, Bella.
No, you go, Craig. I was going to ask another question.
No, I was going to say that I'm actually a bit more positive than Anthony. I think that there's a good chance we'll see change, and the reason we will see change is because the community is starting to really talk about it. One of the things I've had said to me by politicians a lot is we don't lead, we follow. If they feel like they're behind, they feel like they're getting behind community sentiment, there can be a change there. And obviously, if there is a balance of power, in Parliament next time, and Voices for members hold that balance of power, then it's much more likely you are going to get a change, because they are people who have run on that particular issue. You also are seeing, for instance, on a national ICAC, you are seeing Labor saying that they're pro-one. We haven't seen the full model yet, but it does seem to be saying it's closer to the Helen Haynes model than the current one. So I think that we are seeing some movements there, which, because of the pressure of the community, essentially, mean that we might get some positive change. And I don't think, one thing I will say, a positive thing is, I don't think all politicians are terrible. There's some really good people in there. There's actually some really good people on all sides trying to do good things. And the problem is, if you have a structure that's terrible, they find it harder to do things. So there are people in there that do want this stuff to change. But in order to get that to change, they need that community pressure behind them, because they are up against another part of the party that does like the old way.
Again, that's that question I asked around, why are they saying one thing and doing another when it comes into Parliament? Right. So the community needs to create the pressure to make them cross the floor if they need to.
Well, exactly. And this is another reason for the Voices for pressure is, you've got certain electorates where you've got members who are really unaligned from their electorate. The electorate have been saying we need action on climate change for a long time. The members are saying, sure, I'll be doing that, but then you get no action on it. And, you know, you wonder how long that can keep going, that disconnect there. So, I mean, we'll see. I don't know what's going to happen.
I think it's even a bit worse than that, Craig. I must say, I admire you.
I'm trying to be slightly positive here, Anthony.
No, you're much younger than me. I mean, you're entitled to be enthusiastic and positive. I'm old and cynical. But, you know, I thought the moderates come out and say, you know, we believe in taking strong action on climate change, but they can't do it because the party won't let them. Even Trent Zimmerman from North Sydney recently, it was in charge of a committee that more or less shoved Zali Steggall's bill off into the wilderness, her climate change bill. And he made a nice speech about it. And it was very impressive in part. But at one stage he said, we don't want an independent climate authority telling us what to do. That was one of Zali Steggall's ideas. We don't want that to happen because we make policy. We don't want an independent body telling us to make policy. But the fact is, the fossil fuel industry makes policy for the coalition government at the moment. They don't make policy. They just do what their masters say. The masters, as you...
That's very untrue, Anthony. If that was true, you would have had Santos with a kind of demonstration at COP26, and that would... I mean, no satirist would even write such a thing such as that. So I do agree with you. And look, I mean, that in a sense is what's needed at the electoral level. That, you know, in the end, politicians are kind of brutal about numbers. Is that at the moment, unfortunately, what's happened in Australia is we've had a few elections where it's been perceived that it has been won on by the party who's been opposed to change on climate front. In actual fact, what we saw at the last election was not that. We actually saw really big swings in a lot of inner city Conservative seats, swings away from the Conservative Party because of that disconnect there. Now, what needs to essentially change, though, is at the moment there's still the general fear is saying, well, we're fearful of if we do anything, we'll lose these couple of National Party seats or something. If it changes and suddenly you get Voices for Movements or other parties that are dominant, you know, get the balance of power and knock out a few people, the fear will change. The fear will suddenly be, oh my God, we're going to lose all our seats in cities. And that, you know, that will come down essentially to the next election and to how that plays out. So you're in a very interesting test of democracy at the moment.
I know.
And also, let me not kid you. You're up against it. Like, you know, there's a lot of money goes into these parties. It's substantial. They have massive organisations. They have a lot of money behind them. So it really does depend on how much of the community you get out. It's really about that.
Yes, it's a good message for everybody on the call. We need to expand. A couple of questions in the chat, so conscious that I'm keeping an eye on the time. So one for Anthony. Question is, how can something be corrupt but not criminal?
Well, it depends on your definition of corruption. And the definitions of corruption in almost all of the anti-corruption agencies in Australia make it quite clear that serious or systemic conduct of a partisan nature, that is, that threatens the efficacy or privacy of public administration standards, is corrupt conduct. Now, there are limitations put on it because not every time that something like that occurs that it will be corrupt. It has to be, in New South Wales, for example, it has to be a criminal offence or a disciplinary offence sufficient to have somebody dismissed from office, or a breach of the ministerial code of conduct. So it goes well beyond a mere criminal offence, and so it should. I mean, I will put the question back: why are you limiting corruption to a criminal conduct? What's the justification for that? When we see all these things that we disapprove of, but may not be criminal.
I would answer that a different way. I would say the reason there's a difference between what's corrupt and what's actually you can get found corrupt for is that guess who's writing the laws? People have been held accountable for it.
That's a good point leading to this second question. Do you think that any federal ICAC is better than none, with the hope that a future government could add more teeth? So is there a starting point that can be worked, made better? Or is it a bit like with what happened with John Howard? It was too damaging and then they watered it down?
Well, I could certainly say this, that the model that's been put forward, the draft exposure bill that's been put forward, is so worthless that I would say it's better to have no commission of that kind, and just to keep fighting for an adequate and effective commission to come into place. And if there's a change of government, there will be, there's no doubt about that. I mean, there's a strong crossbench that want it, the Greens want it, the Labor Party want it. It's just a coalition holding out. Now, if they change their model, well, we'd have to look at it and see, you know, is it maybe better than nothing? I just don't know yet, but their present model is so bad that I would say we wouldn't want that in at all.
Yeah. So another question is probably for Craig. It seems a lot of people are not connecting how this affects them in their daily lives and almost expect politicians to act badly. So how do we get people to care? Can we illustrate how it hurts the average person's hip pocket, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good thing. And it is interesting that there was a Grattan study of where kind of money in politics generally has an effect. And it tends to operate in areas where there's really technical areas that people don't really understand. It's like it operates in this kind of bureaucratic zone that a lot of people don't realize is happening. So it can be hard sometimes to link it to it. But I would say that in Australia, it's very, very clear that, you know, if you care about the climate, if you care about, you know, half of Australia burning down and that becoming the new normal as we go forward, or worse than that, then our donations do affect us enormously. If you're in, you know, donations for things like gambling have a massive effect. So for instance, Tasmania is a fascinating example there. Tasmania is quite a poor state. You had people sleeping out on football fields in the middle of winter because of lack of accommodation, that kind of stuff. And yet years after years after years, essentially licenses were given away to really wealthy donors that were worth millions and millions of dollars. That's money coming out of our purse. It's money coming out of the person. And that's the case. So yeah, I think people have to realize that, yeah, you know, if these donations lead to these kind of, you know, generally the money that goes the other way, you get a donation of $20,000, $100,000, the money that goes from the public purse towards that company will generally be much larger in the long term. And it comes out of our money. It comes out of our taxes. So it really is something that affects us, but it is hard. And the other thing you said is the really important thing, which is that it's actually the kind of the penny drop moment for Christian and I both in the movie when we were watching, was just when David Barrow talks about the fact that these politicians, they want you to become cynical. They want you to become cynical and disengaged, because how much easier is it for them if that's the case? And that expectation of going, oh, but hang on, all politicians are like that. Oh, all politics is like that, is in a way, it's a giving up that just gives a license to those people to continue operating that way. And that's I know it's a really human response to get so frustrated, you go, I'm getting out. It's actually the opposite you need to do. So people that are here on this call tonight are doing that. It's going, I really am frustrated by that system. I need to engage more and try to make it a better system. And that's the harder thing to do. It's not that politics has to be like this at all. It doesn't have to be. So being engaged, keeping pressure on politicians, whether you're, to be honest, you don't have to be a voices room. You can join the Liberal Party and keep pressure on politicians too, you know. It's being engaged with it rather than just kind of tuning out. The worst thing you can do is to tune out and not have any engagement with it, because then it does just allow the norm to continue.
Yeah. Thank you. Now I'm going to pass to Michelle, who's going to run into our third topic now.
I just offer one little before you do.
Go for it.
You add this point that Craig is right on the money about, excuse the pun, with the gambling industry. I mean, take the casino situation. We've got two findings that Crown Casino is totally unfit to hold a license, but everybody's working so hard to make sure they keep the license. Now, why do you think that's happening? You know, if I was the owner of some little store that had a license and I acted in the way they did, they'd take my license off me and boot me out of the industry forever. But that's not going to happen. And that's the influence of money. And it's shocking, really shocking.
Yeah.
Okay, Michelle.
Okay, so that moves us on to the next part. So far we've been able to work out what integrity is, and talked about what we can reasonably expect from our representatives. It's clear that there's a gap between what we want and what we currently have. So the question is, what can we do as individuals to make change happen? We've talked about that a little bit already. Craig's been talking about that, to stand up, to make a difference. But Craig, we're interested in what you saw and experienced when you were doing the Big Deal series. What were your thoughts on what individuals in an electorate like Benalong can do to restore and maintain integrity in politics? You showcased Indi electorate.
Yeah.
And the voices of movement there. I mean, can we make a difference? Are we wasting our time?
No, look, I think that, I'm not necessarily saying it's just the voices of movement. What is really crucial, and it's part at the core of voices movements, though, is that engagement. Yeah. It's engagement. So the fact that you are getting together, you're talking about what matters in an electorate, even if you don't run a candidate at all or do anything like that, the fact that you've got a group then, and it is very clear, like, you can get a meeting with your local parliamentarian. In Australia, that can happen, right? And you can sit there and you can probably talk to them. But the extent to which that is going to have power compared to somebody who has a really great deal, as we show in the doco, a lot of access continuously is kind of, it's kind of hard to know how much access or how much influence you're going to have. But if you're part of a group like this, where you go, look, I'm not here just saying what Michelle is saying, I'm representing hundreds or thousands of people in this electorate who have all said this is something that's important to them. That has a really big influence. And it does mean that, the democratic process is not irrelevant in Australia. Our politicians do listen to that. So having that ability to communicate and really give voice, what it's doing is increasing the voice of the community. At the moment, our system is really low voice from community, really loud voice from certain vested interests. We need to change the laws so that we can bring down that voice from vested interests. But that also means, with the other side, we need to increase the voice of the community. And that's what a group like this does, or becoming engaged in whatever political. You can be engaged in community groups or otherwise. But those groups that then engage with the political process and represent the views of several or numerous people are really important and it's a central part of democracy. We can't just see our democracy as being just those election points, So yeah, look, that's really important, and I think it don't underplay it. I mean, Voices for Indi is a really interesting example where they did not start out with the intention to run a candidate. It came as a kind of accident that happened along the way because they wouldn't be listened to. Because they had this group of people like, we've been engaging with democracy and yet you're not listening to us. How do we find another way? And they found another way, to the exclusion of the member at the time.
Do you think realistically, if I look at the Liberal Party, and there seems to be, just say on an issue like climate, there seems to be so much pressure on them, and it's so obvious that the tide is turned and the community is standing up and demanding action, which is just fantastic. People are protesting in the streets, and still we see no difference. And I understand why.
We don't see I mean, it's interesting because in actual fact, we've seen is a fundamental change of rhetoric. I mean, today we saw Scott Morrison standing up and saying, we've got electric vehicle policy, having a few years ago said, it's going to ruin the weekend. We've actually seen a large change in the rhetoric. Now, the question for people who care about this, as I will do, is if you look at the detail, there's not a lot there. The question really is going to be at the next election is whether the rhetorical change is enough to fool those people in an electorate where people do care, and whether that's enough. So in actual fact, that response we're seeing today is a response to the growing chorus that's coming from electorate. It's coming from him. It's coming from members saying, look, I'm getting hammered in my electorate because I said last election we'd do something, we've done nothing. It is coming from that pressure that's coming to the electorate. So Scott Morrison is not changing that rhetoric because he wants to be seen to do a 180, U-turn in public. That's an embarrassing thing to have to do. He's doing that because he feels the pressure to actually do it. So I don't think that we should, there is that democratic pressure there, Whether it pressures them to actually do something about it is another question.
Starting with spin. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that, Anthony?
Oh, yes, the rhetoric and the spin. I mean, they have changed their approach, their policy statement enormously. and they've done it, you know, without blushing, as they might do. But then they've accompanied it by a good deal of spin, which makes you wonder whether there's any substance to it at all. I mean, they still want to maintain the growth of coal and gas in Australia, and they'll do as little as they possibly can on that, because from a political point of view, their enemies are the National Party. And so they can't afford to have the coalition split up. And the question is, will the public fall for it? I don't know. I mean, I'm an old cynic, and I sometimes say to myself that things will only change when taxi drivers and Uber drivers stop listening to Alan Jones and Ray Hadley. If that day comes, then I think Australia will be in the clear.
Well, that day's half come. Alan Jones is off the radio and off Sky News now. Yeah. Taxi drivers of Australia, they're going to struggle to hear him.
Maybe there's hope yet.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question that's come through, David, about views on Christian Porter accepting funds from a blind trust.
Yeah.
Well, what do you want? What's the question, though? Do you want me to say it's a good thing, or why it's a terrible?
How can that even happen? I mean, I think the astounding thing is that.
Well, I mean, I think it's just a simple proposition, really, that the Register of Interest requires that there be a disclosure. Politicians are not meant to accept private gifts of a substantial kind, and when he was a minister, he obviously did. And he won't tell us who it is. So I think that the public are rightly condemnatory of that sort of situation. But it's more the way the government itself backs in behind him and says, nothing to see here, let's move on, let's not talk about that sort of stuff. And that's a shame, because
what fascinates me about the response to the Christian Porter Blind Trust is that, generally speaking, when it comes to donations, a very large proportion of donations that are made to political parties, we, the public, never find out who's made them because they're below the disclosure threshold or they go through different mechanisms, whereas the political parties do know. So we seem very outraged by the fact that Christian Porter doesn't know in this one case. The normality of the system is actually worse. The normality of the system is that the politicians all know who has donated, but we don't. That is worse than the blind trust situation. So yes, it's an outrage about Christian Porter, but it's just the fact that we've got used to the normality that we're not outraged by that.
Yeah. It does seem quite insane that's happened, and it's, there's no he has the choice not to disclose. I mean,
it's cost him his career, hasn't it? And so when you think about it, I suppose he might come back.
Many backbenchers have. I mean,
But again, it goes to the problem that Anthony talked about, is that in a lot of these instances, the rules are set up by the political parties, and they have no desire to set up the rules that they're going to get caught by. It's like they're setting up mouse traps that have no cheese and no springs attached because they know they're not going to get caught by them. So, unless you have proper rules there. And when the rules are even there, they generally don't get enforced. Like, restrictions on what job you get after you leave Parliament seem to be breached constantly. So, there needs to be a few more teeth there. And
also the code of conduct at federal level is for ministers only, and it's supervised by the Prime Minister and no one else. He can determine.
I do love how often there's something happens and it's like, I'll defer this to my Chief of Staff to look into it. It's like, great, okay.
When the Chief of Staff produces his report, that's not made public because it's not to be revealed.
Yeah.
Okay. We have another question. I think David's got it there. Do you want to?
And look, I think, Craig, you're absolutely right. I feel like a fifth wheel here. So, but look, here it is. We are seeing an increase in politicians suing members of the public, and indeed, in one case, our public broadcaster for defamation, related to the previous question. Is this related to political integrity, and is this something that a strong federal ICAC would address?
Interesting. I'll defer to Anthony first in this one.
No, I don't think ICAC would have anything to do with that. ICAC's only concerned with, serious serious maladministration or misconduct, I don't think it would be within its remit to chastise a politician for suing someone for defamation. But I do agree with you that it's a kind of worrying trend, because the politicians generally have a lot more clout or money behind them. And so if they want to silence somebody, as we've seen happen, then it's easy for them to do that. And once the litigation's on foot, you know, it becomes something that goes on for months and months and months. And it's not very desirable, but I don't think it's a matter of corruption at all.
No, it's not, but it is a scary trend at the moment. I'm quite fascinated actually as to, you know, in the early 90s, the High Court came up with the idea of a kind of implied freedom of speech with relation to political speech, essentially. And at the time, it was perceived to be a breakthrough that was going to mean that you wouldn't have defamation actions happening in the political sphere because, you know, it's political debate. How we've got to this position now, and I know there's been some backtracking on it, where we've got continually members of parliament, you know, suing people for defamation is extraordinary. It's actually one of the things I really respected about John Howard, actually, former member Benalong, actually, was that he took the attitude that he never sued anyone for defamation, which wasn't this, you know, because he saw it as part of the political process. I'm a member. People are going to hate me and say terrible things about me, but that's part of the democratic process. And that really reflected where I thought the legal dictum was going as well. And it's really frightening now. It's kind of like companies using slap suits. It's a way to silence opposition. And I'm concerned about where it's going.
Well, I think we need to reform the defamation laws. I think that's how we can fix that.
Absolutely. Which ironically, Christian Porter said he wanted to do when he was Attorney General, but it seems to have gone backwards from that now.
Okay. Here's a question. Do you think we're on a slippery slope at the moment if we don't introduce a federal ICAC?
Oh, well, when you say, yeah, we're definitely on a slippery slope. I think we're down the bottom of the hill, really. I think we're already down there if we don't have a federal ICAC. Yeah.
How bad can it get?
Oh, well, I just think that the sort of behaviour we see going on with the misuse of public money and the lack of accountability when it occurs and it's uncovered by the Auditor General, when, you know, if that continues unabated, the political parties on both sides will say, well, look, we can just keep getting away with this, so let's keep doing it. And it's terribly undesirable.
It is. I would like to say, let me just say that, you know, Australia does have a lot of great parts to its democracy. You know, it has an independent electoral commission, it has its compulsory vote. It's not you know, I think it's got some really strong parts, but I do think that in this particular area of donations and money and accountability, it's quite weak at the moment. And I think it is getting worse. I think Anthony's right that, you know, we used to see people stand down for these scandals, and now the approach is you never give up. You just stay on. And that lack of accountability is going to reinforce and become worse and worse. So yeah, I think we really do need to have some changes to these laws. And as I said, that's only going to come if the community kicks up a fuss about it.
Yeah. Okay. One more question I can see there from Sue Bailey. Do the press need to have a bigger role in highlighting?
Yes, the press is terrible at the moment. I mean, yeah, look, part of politicians getting away with this is that in some instances they are protected by the press, although it's not covered. I mean, one of the interesting things about the lack of transparency, for instance, in donations is if at the federal level, if you only report your donations once a year every 12 months, and your donations can be 12 to 18 months out of date from when they're actually given, that immediately means the press are less likely to cover those stories. So that's a kind of structural element that prevents it. But there's also the fact that, you know, a lot of this is seen as the normality by political press corps people. You know, they don't write about it all the time because it's just seen as the norm. So I think the press definitely has a bigger role. And look, to be brutally honest, one of the hard things about doing the Big Deal documentary was just focusing on one issue when there was also going, oh, there's the press issue, There's the, you know, pork barreling issue. There's a lot of different issues that need to be improved. And you know, as we all, when you learn about democracy, one of the important parts of it was the role of the fourth estate, the role of the media. And I think our fourth estate is not playing its role properly at the moment.
I'll add to that also and say it's very bifurcated. You know, you've got sort of two camps that don't really like one another much, with the Murdoch press on one side and Fairfax 9 on the other, and of course the ABC copying it extensively from Sky News After Dark, well named. You know, the media itself can feed into a lack of integrity indirectly, I think, by that bifurcation and the lack of a clear, coherent point of view that we expect. But look, I do think that, you know, the Voices movement is terrific. I would suggest that you get hold of JA, as they call him, and get him to state publicly what his views are on all these issues we've discussed tonight. And then with all your people who are saying what their concerns are, get out there and agitate and promote and complain, whether you have a candidate or not. And the more you're doing that, and the more you do it in a collective and coherent way, you'll have an impression. And that's what we need. We need a bit of anger and a bit of passion and a bit of collectivism on all these issues.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm watching the time and it's time for us to start wrapping up. It's been fabulous to have you both. There are 1,000 more questions that we could talk for hours, I imagine, but in summing up, sort of just addressing what integrity is in terms of accountability, transparency, honesty, is really key to what Voices of Benalong is around. It's some of our core values, and we are focused on advocacy and making change as a group. And we want to create the opportunity to have a federal independent member who can push for change in the federal parliament, particularly to help address some of those systemic issues, Craig, you were talking about, that can help to restore integrity, and then also align that with a federal integrity commission, such as Helen Haynes is pushing through, to just restore some more balance in our democracy. And so that's what we're all about. So thank you again. If you haven't watched The Big Deal, please check it out on ABC iView. It is vital viewing, and keep an eye out for Anthony in the media. There's an excellent Sydney Morning Herald article he wrote last week. If you haven't got it, then David's going to throw the links into the chat for you as well. So, and to sum up, thank you everybody else for joining us today. The thing that we learned from Cathy McGowan last time we had an online event was that we can grow our community by just one of us or all of us who are on the call today taking time to have a discussion and getting another 5-10 people to join our movement through any of our social channels, on our website. We are doing newsletters more regularly, and we will have some more online events, but we are keen to have a meet and greet now that we can meet in the park. So anybody local, we're going to organise that, so keep out on the channels. But really we are about creating a bigger movement, and as Anthony pointed out, even if we don't have a candidate, we want to be advocating for change through the election cycle, and always applying pressure on our federal member to listen to the community. Lastly, again, the event will be live again on YouTube for anybody who might want to rewatch it and write down all those gems that we heard tonight. So thank you very much, and good
Thanks,
night.
guys.
Thanks.
I love the fact you can meet face to face now.
I know.
You can use your social mechanism called talking. It's great.
No, right. That's exactly right. I can't mute people then, though.
Thanks, guys.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks.